Does it work well? Yeah. So, hello everyone, my name is Paula Grzegorzewska and I'm the Senior Policy Advisor at OpenForum Europe. And I'm here today with my colleague Sivan Patch, who is our Research Director. And today we'll present the study on the impact of open source that we conducted together with Fraunhofer ISI for the European Commission. And actually yesterday I participated in a very interesting session on open source program offices. And it seems that there is a lot happening in the public and the private sector when it comes to open source. But to create new or update the existing policies and to shape the digital future, in a way that is open and collaborative, we need some evidence. And our report provides some of this evidence to policymakers, not only on the European level, but also on the member state level. But first, I will quickly just tell you what OpenForum Europe is. We are a Brussels-based independent think tank, and we mostly work on openness in digital. We work on open source software, hardware, open data, interoperability, standardization, and quite some other topics. And OFE was founded in 2002 in the UK with the mission to promote an open and competitive ICT market, including a level playing field for open source. And today, all the topics that we cover really cross-cut with many of the legislative proposals and ideas that policymakers in Europe have. So we talk about topics such as AI, cybersecurity, and cloud services and others. And doing this, we work with a broad set of stakeholders, such as industry, SMEs, association, community, researchers, academia, policymakers. And of course, we're a member of all manner of expert groups, stakeholder groups of the European Union, UN, and other organizations, but I'm not going to go into this right now. So we work a lot on open source and open standards policies, which are our bread and butter, but it also means we work on almost all digital policy fields with perspective of open technologies. And prominent examples are digital and transparent government, public procurement, internet policy, such as net neutrality, cloud computing, and intellectual property or copyright policy. But I'm pretty sure that you're the most interested in the actual results of the study, so let's get into this. So I will focus on open source, on the value of open source, and then Sivan will talk a bit more about policies that are related to it. So yeah, what is the status of open source today when it comes to policies? And the truth is that it's quite niche. In this room, everybody knows everything about open source, I guess, but has your local representative heard about it? Do your politicians know? Does your mayor know something about open source? And clearly, in almost all cases, the answer to that is no, unfortunately. What we see in Brussels is that even those who write digital legislation rarely have a good understanding of what open source is and how to use it for the benefit of the citizens and SMEs and the industry and the public sector itself as well. So we all know that open source is ubiquitous in tech. What company working with code today isn't using open source software? Nobody would start a software project in 2021 without it. For us, it's clear that it saves a lot of development time, it enables innovative projects, it facilitates collaboration and provides equal access. But if we do a little exercise and think about the most recent bits of hard policy coming out of Brussels, it will be hard to find open source there. Just as an exercise, we thought about a few policy fields that digital policymakers engage with on a daily basis. And open source could contribute to policies in these fields, but it's not really present. So when we think about cybersecurity, for example, there you have auditability of code, increasing trust, open source in research and innovation, making innovation more open, increasing access to it, open source in machine learning and AI, making automated decision-making more transparent, open source in high-performance computing, breaking existing lock-in effects of dominant suppliers, open source in telecommunications, ensuring interoperability on all levels of the stack. And if you look at copyright, well, for those that know the Article 13, maybe let's not get into this, but actually none of these policies mention and make use of open source. We have the last year's Commission's digital strategy, 0 mentions. We have the recently updated EU industrial strategy, and it also mentioned open source 0 times. On the other hand, standardization, for example, was mentioned 15 times. But there have been some successes and some moves into using open source in digital policies. So for example, last year we had the Commission's open source strategy that established the open source program office there, which they're doing amazing work, but it's still at the beginning. And also when we think about other files like, I don't know, the Digital Services Act or the AI Act, no mention of open source, not really an analysis that has been done. So the question is, why do policymakers don't know much about open source? A big part of this answer is the lack of cross-sectoral research on the issue and just recommendations that would be clear enough for the policymakers to make use of. And in order to develop and implement policies in a given area, policymakers need evidence. They need a number of jobs that can be created. They need innovation indicators, companies' turnover, and possible economic growth. We need to prove the value of open source to policymakers. And the research that we have done is not necessarily providing all the answers, but it does bring us closer to the goal of supporting open source and showing that it makes sense. And in recent years, there has been an uptick in research on the national level. So we actually saw there was the Open Source Monitor by Bitkom in Germany, which is a report on the use of open source software in the German economy, including a survey of over 800 companies. And there is quite some research in France, actually. So one is a study by CNLL that I'm pretty sure all of you know. And this report includes a survey and quantitative data on the status of open source companies and developments in France, focusing on digital transformation and innovation driven by open source. There is also a very interesting study by one of our collaborators, Professor Frank Nagel from the Harvard Business School, who did a research on the impact of changing procurement law in France. And this law, maybe you know it, I hope, I guess. This law requires government agencies to favor open source software over proprietary software in an attempt to reduce costs. Like, that was the main idea. But what is interesting is that he found that this policy change led to an increase of nearly 600,000 open source contributions per year from France, an increasing number of companies that use open source, and an increased number of jobs in tech, while bringing benefits such as higher competitiveness of the country's IT sector, and both domestically and abroad. So you might ask then, when was the last time when such a research was conducted on the European scale? And the answer is 2006. It was a study, again, procured by the European Commission, but actually it wasn't fully published, and it was not that easy to get our hands on the report. And of course, quite a lot changed in these 15 years, so we were very happy to conduct this study. So here you see the QR code where you can just scan it and access the full study plus a too long didn't read version, because the study itself is almost 400 pages, but there is an executive summary as well. But yeah, this study was conducted by us, so OpenForum Europe, together with Fraunhofer ISI, as a pan-European study on the impact of open source software and open source hardware for the European Commission. And procuring this study shows that the Commission, or at least this one unit inside the Commission, is committed to investigate the potential of open source and evaluate it, and possibly include it in the future policies. So recently there has been an uptick in open source policies, both on EU level and on member state level. And we hope that these results are going to help the policymakers to make those decisions. Okay, let's get into this. The study was published in September, and I will give you an overview of the tasks that we took a look at. I'm not going to delve into all of them, but the first one was the economic analysis, and it was mostly conducted by Professor Knut Blind from the Technical University of Berlin. The second and third one were the policy analysis, where we took the main role. We also took a look at some case studies, both in the public and private sector, and we also finalized with policy recommendations. So first, let's get into the hard numbers, the economic impact. As I have to say, I'm not an economist myself. I didn't come up with these numbers. It was Professor Knut Blind, but I will do my best to bring them a bit closer to you and explain them. And all the numbers that I'm going to talk about are from 2018. This was the last year that we had our data from, and are concerning EU 28, as still then we had the 28 member states. So what is being invested by companies into open source? We found out that over 8.2% of the 3 million employees in computer programming contribute on GitHub. In 2018, there were over 30 million commits to GitHub, which is an effort of more than 16,000 full-time equivalents. We also found out that over 1 billion euros were invested in personal costs in 2018 as well. And what is interesting is that we found out that small and medium companies are the most active when it comes to contributions. So over 75% of the most active contributors had less than 100 employees. And when it comes to benefits, we found this hard and big number. So the contribution of open source to the EU's economy in 2018 was between 65 billion and 95 billion euros. This is a lower bound, so the real number might be even higher. This is about 0.5% to 0.7% of the whole GDP of the European Union. And it means that open source software contributes a similar value to the GDP annually as both air and water transport combined. Another takeaway is that a 10% increase in the number of contributions would bring an increase of 95 billion euros to the EU's GDP. And it should be considered that these are global commits, because open source is fundamentally cross-border. Also, taking into consideration that contribution of open source to the GDP in 2018 are not only based on code developed in 2018, but also on the code in previous years. So the cost-benefit ratio here is 1 to 4, meaning that €1 invested in open source creates a value of €4 in result. This is a really short summary of the economic takeaways. I'm not going to go into the model that we used. It's pretty complicated and takes into account a lot of data. But feel free to take a look at the study itself and read up a bit. We are also happy to answer the questions. If we're not able to answer questions on the economic part, we are happy to share them with Knut, our collaborator. But now I will invite Sivan to talk about the public policy analysis that we have conducted.
Thank you. There we are. I haven't done this in a long time in person. All right. The main purpose of this section is to understand what is the government's relationship to open source and kind of increase our understanding in this area. So as you know, we're doing this study have been doing the study for the European Commission. So there's a frame that what we're doing, there are requirements that they have put on us. And so the question is, what has the Commission asked us to do? Firstly, they asked us to create a framework that would be used to structure the analysis of public policy actions across the countries, that in order to understand how much the government is doing on open source. This could be maybe called a maturity framework. It's not normative in that sense, but more descriptive. And secondly, we wanted to better understand what are the different reasons why have governments engaged with open source, how has this evolved over time over the last 20, 30 years, the motivations that is, and what are the underlying factors at play in these preferences that have changed. And thirdly, we wanted to get an idea of why certain public policy actions work and why others don't work, and of course that's important to make policy recommendations later on. There's also some additional analysis that we've done on open hardware, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, etc. We don't have time for that today, so if you're interested, read the whole report. It's a cool 400 pages, so it's a nice little read in the evening. First, looking at the framework that I mentioned, this is of course extremely important to structure the data analysis, to make the data comparable. I don't have time to go through it, and you're probably very happy that I won't, because it's very complicated, or complicated-ish. A quick summary here on this slide. So we differentiate between two major dimensions in this analysis. The first one is public policies that are aimed at the public sector, and then the second one is public policies that are aimed at the private sector, and both we look at in terms of their outcome. When it comes to the first dimension, that means the public sector aimed at the public sector, we look at elements such as public procurement policies, internal and public strategies, competences that have been acquired, and the degree of success of the implementation of these policies. So when it comes to the second dimension, we were looking at the public sector toward the private sector. Here we're trying to understand how is the government engaging with the private sector, with what aim, does it provide, for example, guidance, and does it engage with communities, etc. And does it take open source into account when legislating on digital policy in general? For the study, we've also relied on a lot of interviews, of course. We've conducted over 50 interviews. So what countries have we looked at? This is the full list. The goal of this selection was to have kind of a broad view on geographic distribution, but also on the different legislative and governmental approaches to give us an idea of the different approaches. Because we don't have so much time, I'll just concentrate on 3 interesting cases, being Italy, Brazil, and South Korea for today. Again, if you want to read the whole thing, you can go and read the whole study. First, looking at Brazil. Brazil is one of those countries that had a lot of interest in open source in the early 2000s. And there's 2 aspects here that are very notable for the specific case of Brazil. The one is that open source really became a movement. So in other countries, there was often the case that economic reasons were the most important. But in Brazil, open source was really motivated first and foremost by the belief that software as a commons. Had also to do, of course, with the government that was in charge back then, which was a social democratic or socialist government. The second point that's interesting about Brazil is that the adoption was not a top-down project. This is again kind of referring back to the movement, but it was brought up from civil society and technical experts into the political level, really got institutionalized in the political level, in the governing party, where it also graduated to a level of politicization, which is not something that open source often achieves, that is really discussed in the political, on the political level. It's more of a, let's say, policy issues, experts, etc. It's also notable that in Brazil, the term of digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty was already used in the early 2000s, something that, of course, we now have as a huge topic. And it's interesting in most of these cases, we're going to look at South Korea in there, that let's say the motivations that we now connect to open source have been there already quite a bit earlier. Open source really was seen as part of a strategy to achieve a sovereign digitalization in the areas of national education, economic growth, autonomy, and development that will surely sound extremely familiar to you if you follow the discussion in Europe right now. So networks here were formed by civil society and technical experts, and those really sort of proved to be the spark that made open source into a movement on the political level. One of interesting area here was the creation of sort of so-called insurgent experts. So those who were working within political, technical, and educational institutions to mobilize collective action. And these networks engaged with the government party at the time, adapting their message to the ideology, so they were quite politically adept in making sure that what they said fulfilled the needs and the requirements of the government or the governing party. So besides the aspect of open source within the public sector, looking at the second dimension I mentioned earlier, the government also saw this as an opportunity to grow a homegrown software sector, independent from international suppliers, again, a familiar theme. Yet at the same time, it's also clear that this did not succeed, and it can't be said that Brazil today or through these actions have created an independent software sector that was able to provide, for example, for complex public procurement, was able to kind of respond to those, but it remained at a very small and fragmented level, which is again a similarity that we also see in Europe today. Internally, so from the perspective of how the government worked, the high level of institutionalization within the Brazilian government played a really important role to effectively coordinate not only the inputs toward the political level, but also the reactions to political inputs. So interviews indicated here that really there were, as soon as the policy entrepreneurs that crafted the government policy on open source, as soon as they left the government, the Brazilian public administration ended their involvement essentially with open source. So it was very important that those who understood open source as a topic within the government stayed within, and we see that also a lot today in other countries, that those people leave for the private sector for whatever reason that might be, and then this knowledge within the public sector goes away, and then also the initiative kind of withers away a bit. So here we can see that institutionalization is a required but not a necessary condition to sustain such a project. And then it's ironic that the current government has finally tabled a bill that made open source preferred in the public procurement, something that the previous government never managed to do, even though they were way more in favor of open source. And of course, the current government is not unproblematic. I'm sure that, going to Italy, so we're going to Europe. This is a country that really aimed high in terms of what it tried and then didn't get a lot out of it, at least yet. In Italy, open source public policy revolves around two articles, Article 68 and 69 of the digital administration legislation. These articles are about public procurement and a platform for open source sharing of software within the government. These have been changed a lot, 17 times since the introduction in 2012. Very iterative, in some sense, maybe an open source approach to legislation. So they really did try to get it right, and it did improve a lot, because the Italian law today is considered, on the face of it, one of the best in the world, but in reality, essentially had no impact at all on how things really worked in the country, because the law was not implemented. So here's a very important kind of takeaway for the analysis, because there was no support for public procurement officers that needed to implement the law. There was no awareness of the laws of the law and complex. And the reality, of course, is that IT procurement is a very complex process, and in many cases, public procurement officers will procure everything from grass to software to doors. And if you have to kind of do all of these different things, you do need support from your central, let's say, administration body, if you want to be able to do this right and be able to understand what are these new requirements when it comes to public procurement favoring open source. That is a pretty grim picture for Italy, but it seems to be also light at the end of the tunnel. The Italian government has really made strong improvements over the last 1 or 2 years, trying to create a digital transformation within the Italian government, and they have also finally released a comprehensive guide on how this policy needs to be implemented, because it was essentially, I think, 4 or 5 paragraphs of text that is difficult to implement without further guidance, and it was, I think, 150 pages of text, this guidance, that we hope, let's say, will help a lot to make this open source policy a reality. And then moving on to our last little example, to South Korea. Here you will see kind of a different story emerging than the two others, maybe. Unlike in Italy and Brazil, the South Korean government doesn't pay a lot of attention on the issue of procuring open source software, so the public sector toward the public sector angle. It's not a priority. What they do pay a lot of attention to is industry. And here you'll see South Korea using a lot of words that we hear now day to day in our, let's say, policy life, some of us at least, engaging a lot with. You hear digital sovereignty, you talk about creating a local industry, providing services and using open source for that, and doing that all, providing that all through Korea, through Korean companies. Korea is also working a lot with other Southeast Asian countries in this effort, and they have tried to, in this effort to the softwareization of the Korean industry, and the, checking now who said this because I don't remember. Well, the person, I think it was the minister, I think, who said that open source is the basis of all these activities in the area of softwareization of industry. And they have made this analysis about dependence on the United States, and came to the conclusion that open source is the way to create more control over the technology that they have. They've also created multiple institutions that provide consulting services, provide licensing advice, inspecting code vulnerabilities, provide open source governance advice and trainings. There's the Korea Copyright Commission, which provides license compliance help, which has a 3 million annual budget. There's an open source software competence plaza with a 12 million annual budget. There's COS Labs, an open source incubator, and the National IT Promotion Agency has an annual budget of 360 million and also puts a heavy emphasis on open source. And I think it's fair to say that this kind of emphasis on open source, at least on the EU level, currently is not present. So you can see that these approaches are a bit different. I wanted to take a quick step backward There's the framework that we talked about a bit earlier. So what happens if we take those three cases and we apply the framework and figure out kind of where we are in terms of maturity, in terms of kind of the expansiveness of open source policies. You see that the differences emerge here that I've talked about in terms of the dimensions, the public sector toward public sector, the public sector toward private sector. Italy and Europe in general, I can also say this, very much focuses on the public sector. It's a very good law, but it's not very well implemented, and doesn't do much on the private sector. And then on the other hand, if we go to South Korea, the direction is very different, focuses on the private sector and has a lot of activities on the public sector side. And while Brazil doesn't do a lot these days, there were past achievements that have essentially been lost, so that's why the numbers are a bit lower. All right, so I talked a bit about what these countries are doing regarding open source, but I also wanted to talk a little about what we have found out. Why do countries engage with open source? So there's four main complexes that are relevant here. On the one hand, there's the economic concerns. That is something that often, especially considered in the early 2000s, so very important here is cost savings. That for a long time was a very important and very big reason why governments engage with open source, and today isn't such a big motivator anymore. Switching cost, network effects, underproduction of public goods, and market competition and technological neutrality. Of course, that today plays a more important role. Technical concerns have always been kind of there, and it hasn't changed a lot. Yet, on the other side, political concerns, that is something that has become much more prominent recently, especially the issue of independence. And this has also been already an issue for longer in Asia. Consider here governance, there's independence, this, let's say, anti-US complex that sometimes can be observed regarding software, and also the issue of digitization and fast and effective digitization. And then lastly, legal concerns, that's something that governments always have to deal with when they do public policy and open source. Yeah, I think we can actually skip ahead on this one. So, trying to kind of synthesize this a little bit into a few takeaways. So why do governments engage with open source? And maybe also you've noticed this kind of pattern emerging. There's two kind of waves that can be identified regarding open source support by governments. There was a first wave in the early 2000s that started in the early 2000s and ended around the mid 2010s. And it's quite interesting to look at kind of what are the frames that pushed that wave and how it's different today, because the first wave, that was a lot about activism, that was a lot about cost reduction, cheap, emphasizing the fact that open source can be cheaper, and that the fact that open source can be more innovative, collaborative, etc. Very much brought in through policy entrepreneurship within the government. And I don't think then the advantages of open source were fully realized, and that's also why that kind of wave died down. And then if we look at the second wave, that started in the mid-2010s, so took over then, that seems to be more born out of open source becoming ubiquitous in the private sector, and the government kind of catching on a little bit on that, more focused on the collaborative advantages, the innovative potential, and also more focused on supporting the private sector. And well, in both cases, I guess Asia was first there. A few further kind of points on synthesis. So where we see that government initiatives, where they don't work and where they work, we've seen in Italy, writing a good law doesn't mean that a good implementation will follow, so there's more to it than just writing a good law. This is, of course, the most difficult part when legislating toward the public sector, because the issue of awareness that I've mentioned, as well as education, has to be considered. So when trying to convince a bureaucracy, many in the bureaucracy won't understand or know anything about open source software. That means sometimes there will be very low intrinsic motivation for public bureaucrats to understand and to realize its potential. So the success of such a project really depends on creating an open source culture within the organization and to foster this culture within the organization. So here, one of the tasks that I think can be identified is to use an external spark within the public sector to create such an intrinsic motivation through education and awareness. Those 2 points are really very important. And that can be easier when approaching the private sector, because here, of course, there's economic interests, economic motivations that don't apply in the same way to the public sector. And that's also why I think some of the Asian countries have had more success, maybe sometimes, with such policies that are aimed at the private sector. Another issue is political support. We've seen this in a lot of cases. We all know political support changes over time, government changes, etc. So how do you protect such a transformation from such changes? There's a very difficult question to answer because if you don't have a well-institutionalized initiative, it becomes even more difficult, almost maybe impossible. And as I said, this is something, institutionalization is something that is a necessary but not sufficient condition to sustain such a change. So when trying to attack this problem, the level of prescriptiveness of legislation doesn't seem to play a big role. There's an example, for example, in Bulgaria, where they really mandated the use of open source in public procurement. I think there were even fines attached to it, and it had still zero impact because nobody enforced it. So really, to increase the quality of implementation, culture is the key, and that is what we've seen again and again, an open source culture that touches the organization, transforms an organization, and transforms how an organization internally works in, let's say, an open innovation way. So it goes further than just code. And it's about changing the default, how people work, working in the open, iterating fast, all of these aspects. That's not always very easy to do in the public sector, of course, because that doesn't tend to be an organization that changes very quickly. But that seems to be one of the most important factors. And the bigger the organization, the more difficult that is. Most really successful examples are more on the regional level. And then institutionalization, I've already talked about this. I want to emphasize political support from a high level. That's really important. It's really necessary to kind of get off the ground, and either top down or bottom up, the political level has to be convinced. Otherwise, it's not realistic to hope for a success. I think I will skip over the summary slide, and I'll just go and quickly check the time. Perfect. So let's look a bit at the policy recommendations. Of course, all this work to analyze policy and all this work to analyze the economic impact is to provide the European Commission with recommendations on how and what they should do to maximize the benefits for open source software in Europe. So I'll provide a brief overview of the policy recommendations that we have put together. There's 13 main recommendations. We've put this in 3 main visions to make it a bit more digestible. The first one is creating a digitally autonomous public sector. The second one is facilitating open R&D, enabling European growth. And the third one is achieving a digitized and internationally competitive industry. So all of these recommendations go in the different categories. Of course, I'll summarize it. So again, if you want to have more information, just go to the final report. Here's a quick overview of the main recommendation categories. I won't stay very long here, but I'll give you a short view because that will give you a good idea on what are the main areas that we tackle. But let's go into the first one. So the first one is a digitally autonomous public sector. How can we foster open source in the public sector, essentially? Of course, today, that is what the economic analysis has surfaced, let's say. Open source creates a lot of value in Europe. But the current institutional capacity to facilitate taking advantage of this value currently is insufficient on the institutional level. So although the EU, for example, has numerous open source and open source hardware initiatives, they're fragmented, they lack coordination, and that leads to a lower efficiency of those actions. So what we recommend to the European Commission is to sponsor 20 open source program offices across different sectors, meaning public sector, industry, academia, etc., that would coordinate open source software-related efforts within and across sectors to increase those knowledge flows. And so the Commission Open Source Program Office that already exists and is being built up now should become such a, let's say, spider in the web, activating these disparate and uncoordinated efforts across the European Union. So our analysis has shown that the awareness and culture is everything. I mentioned this. Here, the main goal is to try to create and propagate a European open source culture across the public sector, horizontally and vertically, as the main task really for this action. And also, for this to be successful, of course, there needs to be more information, there needs to be more understanding. So we also recommend updating regularly the studies and creating more specific, more detailed knowledge. Going to the second section, how to foster open source in research. How can we kind of embed open source into R&D? there we see that there needs to be an understanding, a realization within the policymakers that there's a virtuous cycle associated with open source software. As Paula has mentioned, every public euro that you spend on open source software results in 4 euros of value created. In addition to that, the code, of course, being publicly available, can be again taken up by others in research and by others in SME, startups, etc., also big companies, of course, to build new products on top of that. Yeah, this is one of the things that we think is very important to have the public sector realize the economic impact of that. One other area is education, where open source also needs to be embedded. That doesn't mean only curricula, of course that's important, but also to create transferable skills. And for example, another recommendation is to have open source certification that should be considered to certify skills. And then lastly, looking at open source and industry, the current public capital that is going out of funding instruments is not really aimed at all at open source software. There's some smaller examples, but this should be changed. That means that the public sector should fund specifically high-risk R&D-intensive startups that have open source as the basis of their business model to achieve those, let's say, big gains. It's something that maybe the German government, for example, is looking at now with Sprint. Maybe some of you are aware of this initiative, which is an agency for disruptive innovation that uses a lot of open source. And I think president it is, or founding director, I'm not sure what his title is, previously was the CEO of Open Exchange. In addition to that, if we look at currently existing intellectual property and public procurement legislation, that should be adopted to remove the structural disadvantage that open source currently is at regarding these regimes, and to make sure that open source is subjected to a more level playing field and that such a business model can succeed more easily. And then also open source should also be seen as a possibility to contribute to probably the biggest challenge of our time, climate change. Here the inherent reusability of open source software, but as well also as open hardware, should be taken advantage of. Reusability meaning reducing effort, but also making sure that resource usage is optimized. In addition to that, improving the repairability of components with open source hardware should be considered, for example, to satisfy maintenance requirements that are in the law. After 5 years, you don't have to support the product anymore. You can put the plans online and people can support it themselves. All right, so just a really super quick summary now of the whole study as a whole thing. The first point is open source has a large economic impact, and there's a huge potential impact of open source hardware. Second point is that the European Union should use public policy to scale and incentivize production of open source for the European economy. And thirdly, there's a need for a comprehensive and coordinated policy approach to increase institutional capacity across the public sector and to realize these advantages for Europe. We hope that the European Commission will make some announcement rather sooner than later on this. All right, if you want to contact us, here's our email addresses and our Twitter handle. If we have a minute in case there's any questions, I don't know. 7 minutes. We can even answer some questions if there's any.
Sort of a question and a comment. When do you say open source, what do you mean? Open source software and hardware, both?
Yes, both. The study, as the title, I don't think we have the whole title on any slide actually, but the study specifically covers open source software and open source hardware. In terms of the economic analysis, of course, we're in different stages in the development and maturity of those two technologies, or well, to call open source a technology is maybe not the right term, but open source software, of course, is much farther along in terms of its maturity. Open source hardware is still an emerging, something that is emerging, and in terms of the economic analysis, that means that we could assess the economic impact of open source software, but we couldn't assess the economic impact specifically of open source hardware because there's not enough data yet.
Yeah. That's why I'm saying it's better to always clarify, to say precisely what you mean, because at least when you source software and hardware, it's very confusing because in the same world, OS is a well-established acronym for operating system. Operating system is a huge topic in itself in open source software, but just to avoid this sort of confusion, OS is operating system.
Yeah.
Full stop.
Very fair point.
And free OSS, it's open source software. It's an established acronym in this world. That's why it's not a good idea to use OS.
Yeah, but when we say OS, it means both. If we say OSS, it means
established acronym in the
yes.
software for operating system. That's why I'm saying
operating.
when you use OS,
Right.
meaning open source software, it's not a good
Yeah.
idea at all.
All right. I hope at one of the slides it says open source and then in parentheses OS, but I will check if it does. Yeah?
I'm not even sure if this is the right place to ask this question, but
Let's
at
see.
the conference, this is as appropriate to anywhere else. Not 2 months ago, I attended the Creative Commons Summit, and you could take the policy recommendations and do a search and replace from open source to Creative Commons and come up with almost exactly the same policy recommendations. This is a matter of changing culture in governments towards open, and it's a matter of changing attitudes just in general towards sharing versus proprietary.
Yeah.
Why isn't the open source world and the Creative Commons world doing much together in advancing this cultural change? As we find that there's now a blurring. I mean, as you were saying, you want to be specific about open source, and then The Economist publishes a front page story on open source intelligence, which means something way broader than software. And so the terminology is actually being appropriated by the mainstream for something that goes, in some cases, way beyond software. I'm just wondering why the various, shall we say, sharing communities, sharing culture communities are not trying to make a more concerted effort together in trying to make this policy change at government level.
Firstly, to say I fully agree that these topics are very closely related. At the end of the day, one could, summarize them under an open innovation label, and you can see open data, open access, open science, open source, and it's about working the open, making the results of your work openly available. So I fully agree that those things are really very strongly related. Difficult question to answer on why it's not considered enough together. I think in terms of kind of collective action on the European level, which is what kind of sort of my more expertise lies, it's not always very easy for these specific actors, let's say, that on the European level advocate here to make their voice heard, because it's, let's say, if you look at other industries, imagine the car industry, they are very good at making their voices heard in Brussels or in any national government. But I think it's fair to say that we are maybe not quite as good at it. So the collective action issue here, that I think maybe lies at the kind of the heart of your point, is something that remains unresolved. That the effectiveness of advocating for these things is relatively low, and I agree we should work more together, which is a very open source thing to do. Yeah, no, I agree. It's finished. Right, no more questions. All right, thank you very much for your attention.